Oh, you know what I forgot to do? Oh, I also forgot to mute my mic. Holy shit, whoopsies. Hello. I had a little bit of an oopsie there earlier. I don't know if anyone actually heard it, but I forgot to mute my mic and my desktop audio before I started the stream. I corrected myself. I corrected myself like about a minute in or so. I mean, it happens. No one's perfect. But yeah, hello. We're doing the thing again tonight. I actually have my green tea with me right now. I remembered to put lemon juice in it this time, so hopefully... I mean, it is pretty good. I've been sipping on it as I was waiting for 6 o'clock to hit. But, I feel like this is gonna be... It's gonna be good for my throat. And hopefully I won't sound as bad as I did last time. I'm still not sure what happened last time either. Because, I don't know. Sometimes your voice just like decides to give out on you for no apparent reason. Let me take another sip. But yeah, I did move my mic stand a little bit far off towards like the edge of the table instead of like right up next to me. So hopefully that's gonna like minimize the amount of feedback we get from like me moving things around on the desk. But yeah, we're back to reading Misery. Last time, if you really if you didn't catch up, if you've been lagging behind, last time we left off, Paul had left his room in Annie's absence, and he got back in just in the nick of time before she came in the door. But he had some pills. He took some pills, and he forgot to hide them in his lap. So they're still in his lap. I'm not sure how he's gonna get himself out of this jam, but we'll see. So I guess we're just gonna get right into it now. She had 2 packages of paper, and she held one up in each hand, smiling. Just what you asked for, isn't it? Triad modem. 2 reams here, and I have 2 more in the kitchen just in case. So you see, she broke off, frowning, looking at him. You're dripping with sweat, and your color is very hectic. She paused. What have you been doing? And although that set the panicky little voice of his lesser self to squealing again, that he was caught and might as well give up, might as well confess and hope for her mercy, he managed to meet her suspicious gaze with an ironic weariness. I think you know what I've been doing, he said. I've been suffering. From the pocket of her skirt, she took a Kleenex and wiped his brow. The Kleenex came away wet. Shh. Hey, hold on. I lost my place. She smiled at him and with that terrible bogus maternity. Has it been very bad? Yes. Yes, it has. Now can I told you about making me mad. Live and learn, isn't that what they say? Well, if you live, I guess you'll learn. Can I have my pills now? In a minute, she said. Her eyes never left his sweaty face, its waxy pallor and red rash-like blotches. First, I want to make sure there's nothing else you want. Nothing else stupid old Annie Wilkes forgot because she doesn't know how a Mr. Smart Guy goes about writing a book. I want to make sure you don't want me to go back to town and get you a tape recorder, or maybe a special pair of writing slippers or something like that. Because if you want me to, I'll go. Your wish is my command. I won't even wait to give you your pills. I'll hop right into old Bessie again and go. So what do you say, Mr. Smart Guy? You all set? I'm all set, he said. Annie, please. And you won't make me mad anymore? No, I won't make you mad anymore. Because when I get mad, I'm not really myself. Her eyes dropped. She was looking down to where his hands were cupped tightly together over the sample boxes of Novril. She looked for a very long time. Paul, she asked softly. Paul, why are you holding your hands like that? He began to cry. It was guilt he cried from, and he hated that most of all. In addition to everything else that this monstrous woman had done to him, she had made him feel guilty as well. So he cried from guilt, but also from simple childish weariness. He looked up at her, tears flowing down his cheeks, and played the absolute last card in his hand. "I want my pills," he said. "And I want the urinal. I held it all the time you were gone, Annie, but I can't hold it much longer. And I don't want to wet myself again." She smiled softly, radiantly, and pushed his tumbled hair off his brow. "You poor dear. Annie's put you through a lot, hasn't she? Too much. Mean old Annie. I'll get it right away." He wouldn't have dared put the pills under the rug, even if he thought he had time to do so before she came back. The packages were small, but the bulges would still be all too obvious. As he heard her go into the downstairs bathroom, he took them, reached painfully around his body, and stuffed them into the back of his underpants. Sharp cardboard corners poked into the cleft of his buttocks. She came back with the urinal, an old-fashioned tin device that looked absurdly like a blow-dryer, in one hand. She had 2 Novril capsules and a glass of water in the other. 2 more of those on top of the ones you took half an hour ago may drop you into a coma and then kill you, he thought, and a second voice answered at once. "Fine with me." He took the pills and swallowed them with water. She held out the urinal. "Do you need help?" "I can do it," he said. She turned considerately away while he fumbled his, genital area, I'm not repeating that, into the cold tube and urinated. He happened to be looking at her when the hollow splashing sounds commenced, and he saw that she was smiling. "All done?" she asked a few moments later. Yes. He actually had needed to urinate quite badly. In all the excitement, he hadn't had time to think of such things. She took the urinal away from him and set it carefully on the floor. "Now let's get you back in bed," she said. "You must be exhausted, and your legs must be singing grand opera." He nodded, although the truth was that he could not feel anything. This medication, on top of what he'd already given himself, was rolling him towards unconsciousness at an alarming rate, and he was beginning to see the room through gauzy layers of gray. He held on to one thought. She was going to lift him into the bed, and when she did that, she would have to be blind as well as numb not to notice that the back of his underwear happened to be stuffed with little boxes. She got him over to the side of the bed. "Just a minute longer, Paul, and you can take a snooze." "Annie, could you wait 5 minutes?" he managed. She looked at him, gaze narrowing slightly. "I thought you were in a lot of pain, Buster." "I am," he said. "It hurts. Too much. My knee, mostly. Where you lost your temper. I'm not ready to be picked up. Could I have 5 minutes to... He knew what he wanted to say, but it was drifting away from him. Drifting away and into the gray. He looked at her helplessly, knowing he was going to be caught after all. "To let the medication work?" she asked, and he nodded gratefully. "Of course. I'll just put a few things away and come right back." As soon as she was out of the room, he was reaching behind him, bringing out the boxes and stuffing them under the mattress one by one. The layers of gauze kept thickening, moving steadily from gray toward black. "Get them as far under as you can," he thought blindly. "Make sure you do that so if she changes the bed, she won't pull them out with the ground sheet. Get them as far under as you... He shoved the last under the mattress, then leaned back and looked up at the ceiling, where the W's danced drunkenly across the plaster. Africa, he thought. Now I must rinse, he thought. Oh, I am in so much trouble here, he thought. Tracks, he thought. Did I leave tracks? Did I... Paul Sheldon fell unconscious. When he woke up, 14 hours had gone by, and outside it was snowing again. Oh man, that's actually the end of part one. We're on to part two now. Part two of the book. I think there's like 3 or 4 parts in this. I'm not sure, but it's one of them. All right, we're on to part two. Let me take a break so I can take another sip. Okay. All right. Writing does not cause misery. It is born of misery. Montaigne. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. It's a quote from a guy. Misery's Return by Paul Sheldon for Annie Wilkes. Chapter 1. Although Ian Carmichael would not have moved from Little Dunthorpe for all the jewels in the Queen's treasury, he had to admit to himself that when it rained in Cornwall, it rained harder than anywhere else in England. There was an old strip of toweling hung from a hook in the entryway, and after hanging up his dripping coat and removing his boots, he used it to towel his dark blonde hair dry. Distantly from the parlor, he could hear the rippling strains of Chopin, and he paused with the strip of towel still in his left hand, listening. The moisture running down his cheeks now was not rainwater, but tears. He remembered Joffrey saying, "You must not cry in front of her, old man. That is the one thing you must never do." Joffrey was right, of course. Dear old Joffrey was rarely wrong. But sometimes when he was alone, the gearless of misery's escape from the Grim Reaper came forcibly back to him, and it was nearly impossible to hold the tears back. He loved her so much. Without her, he would die. Without misery, there would simply be no life left for him, or in him. Her labor had been long and hard, but no longer and no harder than that of many other young ladies she had seen, the midwife declared. It was only after midnight, an hour after Joffrey had ridden into the gathering storm to try and fetch the doctor, that the midwife had grown alarmed. That was when the bleeding had started. Dear old Joffrey, he spoke it aloud this time as he stepped into the huge and stuporously warm West Country kitchen. "Did ye speak, young sire?" Miss Rampage, the Carmichaels' crotchety but lovable old housekeeper, asked him as she came in from the pantry. As usual, her mob cap was askew, and she smelled of the snuff she still firmly believed, after all these years, to be a secret vice. "Not on purpose, Mrs. Rampage," Ian said. "By the sound of ye coat a-drippin' out there in the entry, ye nearly drowned between the sheds and the hoose." "Aye, so I nearly did," Ian said, and thought, if Joffrey had returned with the doctor even 10 minutes later, I believe she would have died. This was a thought he tried consciously to discourage. It was both useless and gruesome, but the thought of life without misery was so terrible that it sometimes crept up on him and surprised him. Now, breaking into these gloomy meditations, there came the healthy bawl of a child. His son, awake and more than ready for his afternoon meal. Faintly he could hear the sound of Annie Wilkes, Thomas's capable nurse, as she began to soothe him and change his napkin. "The wee bairn's in good voice today," Mrs. Rampage observed. Ian had one moment to think again, with surpassing wonder, that he was the father of a son, and that his wife spoke from the doorway. "Hello, darling." He looked up, looked at his misery, his darling. She stood lightly poised in the doorway, her chestnut hair with its mysterious deep red glints, like dying embers, flowing over her shoulders in gorgeous profusion. Her complexion was still too pallid, but in her cheeks Ian could see the first signs of returning color. Her eyes were dark and deep, and the glow of the kitchen lamps sparkled in each, like small and precious diamonds lying upon darkest jeweler's felt. "My darling," he cried, and ran to her, as he had that day in Liverpool, when it seemed certain that the pirates had taken her away as Mad Jack Wickersham had sworn they would. Mrs. Rampage suddenly remembered something she had left undone in the parlor, and left them together. She went, however, with a smile on her face. Mrs. Rampage, too, had her movements, when she could not help wondering what life might have been like if Joffrey and the doctor had arrived an hour later on that dark and stormy night 2 months ago, or if the experimental blood transfusion in which her young master had so bravely poured his own life's blood into Misery's depleted veins had not worked. "Ooh, gruel," she told herself as she hurried down the hall. "Some things do not bear thinking, Good advice. Advice Ian had given himself. But both had discovered that good advice was sometimes easier to give than receive. In the kitchen, Tall hugged Misery tightly to him, feeling his soul live and die and then live again in the sweet smell of her warm skin. He touched the swell of her breast and felt the strong and steady beat of her heart. "If you had died, I should have died with you," he whispered. She put her arms about his neck, bringing the firm of her breast more fully into his hand. "Hush, my darling," Misery whispered. "And don't be silly. I'm here, right here. Now kiss me. If I die, I fear it will be with desire for you." He pressed his mouth against hers and plunged his hands deeply into the glory of her chestnut hair, and for a few moments there was nothing at all except for the two of them. Annie laid the 3 pages of typescript on the night table beside him, and he waited to see what she would say about them. He was curious, but not really nervous. He had been surprised, really, at how easy it had been to slip back into Misery's world. Her world was corny and melodramatic, but that did not change the fact that returning there had been nowhere near as distasteful as he had expected. It had been, in fact, rather comforting, like putting on a pair of old slippers. So his mouth dropped open, and he was frankly and honestly flabbergasted when she said, "It's not right." You don't like it?" He could hardly believe it. How could she have liked the other Misery novels and not like this? It was so Misery-esque, it was nearly a caricature. What with motherly old Miss Rampage dipping snuff in the pantry, Ian and Misery pawing each other like a couple of horny kids just home from the Friday night high school dance, and now she was the one who looked bewildered. "Like it? Of course I liked it. It's beautiful." When Ian swept her into his arms, I cried. I couldn't help it. Her eyes actually were a bit red. And you naming baby Thomas's nurse after me, it was very sweet. He thought smart, too. At least I hope so. And by the way, Toots, the baby's name started out to be Sean, in case you're interested. I changed it because I decided that was just too fucking many N's to fill in. Then I'm afraid I don't understand. No, you don't. I didn't say anything about not liking it. I said it wasn't right. It's a cheat. You'll have to change it. He had once thought of her as the perfect audience. Had he once thought of her as the perfect audience? Oh boy. I have to give you credit, Paul. When you make a mistake, you go whole hog. Constant reader had just become merciless editor. Without his even being aware that it was happening, Paul's face rearranged itself into the expression of sincere concentration he always wore while listening to editors. He thought of this as, "Can I help you, lady?" as his "Can I help you, lady?" expression. That was because most editors were like women who drive into service stations and tell the mechanic to fix whatever it is that's making that knocking sound under the hood or going wonk wonk inside the dashboard. And please have it done an hour ago. A look of sincere concentration was good because it flattered them. And when editors were flattered, they would sometimes give in on some of their mad ideas. "How is it a cheat?" he said. "Well, Joffrey rode for the doctor," she said. "That's all right. That happened in chapter 38 of Misery's Child. But the doctor never came, as you well know, because Joffrey's horse tripped on the top rail of that rotten Mr. Cranthorpe's toll gate when Joffrey tried to jump it. I hope that dirty bird gets his comeuppance in Misery's Return, Paul. I really do. And Joffrey broke his shoulder and some of his ribs, and lay there most of the night in the rain until the sheepherder's boy came along and found him. So the doctor never came. You see? Yes." He found himself suddenly unable to take his eyes from her face. He had thought she was putting on an editor's hat, maybe even trying on a collaborator's chapeau, preparing to tell him what to write and how to write it. But that was not so. Mr. Cranthorpe, for instance. She hoped Mr. Cranthorpe would get his comeuppance, but she did not demand it. She saw the story's creative course as something outside of her hands, in spite of her obvious control of him. But some things simply could not be done. Creativity, or the lack of it, had no bearing on these things. To do them was as foolish as trying a proclamation revoking the law of gravity or trying to play table tennis with a brick. She really was constant reader, but constant reader did not mean constant sap. She would not allow him to kill Misery, but neither would she allow him to cheat Misery back into life. But Christ, I did kill her, he thought wearily. What am I going to do? When I was a girl, she said, they used to have chapter plays at the movies, an episode a week. The Masked Avenger and Flash Gordon, even one about Frank Buck, the man who went to Africa to catch wild animals and who could subdue lions and tigers just by staring at them. Do you remember the chapter plays? I remember them, but you can't be that old, Annie. You must have seen them on TV, or had an older brother or sister who told you about them. At the corners of her mouth, dimples appeared briefly in the solidity of flesh, and then disappeared. Go on with you, you fooler. I did have an older brother, though, and we used to go to the movies every Saturday afternoon. This was in Bakersfield, California, where I grew up. And while I always used to enjoy the newsreel and the color cartoons and the feature, what I really looked forward to was the next installment of the chapter play. I'd find myself thinking about it at odd moments all week long. If a class was boring, or if I had to babysit Mrs. Krenmit's 4 brats downstairs, I used to hate those little brats. Annie lapsed into a moody silence, staring into the corner. She had become unplugged. It was the first time this had happened in some days, and he wondered uneasily if it meant she was slipping into the lower part of her cycle. If so, he had better batten down his hatches. At last she came out of it, and as always with an expression of faint surprise, as if she had not really expected the world to still be there. Rocket Man was my favorite. There he would be at the end of chapter 6, Death in the Sky, unconscious while his plane went into a power dive. Or at the end of chapter 9, Fiery Doom, he'd be tied to a chair in a burning warehouse. Sometimes it was a car with no brakes, sometimes poison gas, sometimes electricity. Annie spoke of these things with an affection which was bizarre in its unmistakable genuineness. Cliffhangers, they called them, he ventured. She frowned at him. I know that, Mr. Smart Guy. Gosh, sometimes I think you must believe I'm awful stupid. I don't, Annie, really. She waved a hand at him impatiently, and he understood it would be better, today at least, not to interrupt her. It was fun to try and think how he would get out of it. Sometimes I could, sometimes I couldn't. I didn't really care as long as they played fair, the people who made the story. She looked at him sharply to make sure he was taking the point. Paul thought he could hardly have missed it. Like when he was unconscious in the airplane. He woke up and there was a parachute under his seat. He put it on and jumped out of the plane, and that was fair enough. Thousands of English comp teachers would disagree with you, my dear, Paul thought. What you're talking about is called a Deus Ex Machina, a god from the machine, first used in Greek amphitheaters. When the playwright got his hero into an impossible jam, this chair decked with flowers came down from overhead. The hero sat down on it and was drawn up and out of harm's way. Even the stupidest swain could grasp the symbolism. The hero had been saved by God. But the Deus Ex Machina, sometimes known in the technical jargon as the old parachute under the airplane seat trick, finally went out of vogue around the year 1700. Except, of course, for such arcana as the Rocket Man serials and the Nancy Drew books. I guess you missed the news, Danny. For one gruesome, never-to-be-forgotten moment, Paul thought he was going to have a laughing fit. Given her mood this morning, though it almost surely have resulted in some unpleasant and painful punishment, he raised a hand quickly to his mouth, pasting it over the smile trying to be born there, and manufactured a coughing fit. She thumped him on the back hard enough to hurt. Better? Yes, thanks. Can I go on now, Paul? Or were you planning to have a sneezing fit? Should I get the bucket? Do you feel as if you might have to vomit a few times? No, Annie, please go on. What you're saying is fascinating. She looked a little mollified. Not much, but a little. When he found that parachute under the seat, it was fair. Maybe not all that realistic, but fair. He never thought about this, startled. Her occasional sharp insights never failed to startle him, and decided it was true. Fair and realistic might be synonyms in the best of all possible worlds, but if so, this was not that world. Will you take another episode, she said. And this is exactly what's wrong with what you wrote yesterday, Paul, so listen to me. I'm all ears. She looked at him sharply to see if he was joking. His face, however, was pale and serious, very much the face of a conscientious student. The urge to laugh had dissipated when he realized that Annie might know everything about the Deus Ex Machina except the name. All right, she said. This was a no-breaks chapter. The bad guys put Rocket Man, only it was Rocket Man and his secret identity, into a car that didn't have any brakes, and then they welded all the doors shut, and then they started the car rolling down this twisty-turny mountain road. I was on the edge of my seat that day, I can tell you. She was sitting on the edge of his bed. Paul was sitting across the room in the wheelchair. It had been 5 days since his expedition into the bathroom and the parlor, and he had recuperated from that experience faster than he would ever have believed. Just not being caught, it seemed, was a marvelous restorative. Hold on, let me take a sip. There we go. She looked vaguely at the calendar, where the smiling boy rode his sled through an endless February. So there was poor old Rocket Man stuck in that car without his rocket pack, or even his special helmet with the one-way eyes, trying to steer and stop the car and open the side door, all at the same time. He was busier than a one-armed paper hanger, I can tell you. Yes, Paul could suddenly see it, and in an instinctive way, he understood exactly how such a scene, absurdly melodramatic as it might be, could be milked for suspense. The scenery, all of it canted at an alarming downhill angle rushing by. Cut to the brake pedal, which sinks bonelessly to the mat with the man's foot. He saw the foot clearly, clad in a 1940s-style air-tip shoe, stomps on it. Cut to his shoulder hitting the door. Cut to the outside reverse, showing us an irregular bead of solder where the door had been sealed shut. Stupid, sure. Not a bit literary, but you could do something with it. You could speed up pulses with it. No Chivas Regal here. This was the fictional equivalent of backwoods popsicle. So then you saw that road just ended at this cliff, she said. And everyone in the theater knew that if Rocket Man didn't get out of that old Hudson before it got to the cliff, he was a gone goose. Oh boy. And here comes the car, with Rocket Man still trying to put on the brakes or bash the door open. And then, over it went. It flew out into space and then it went down. It hit the side of the cliff about halfway down and burst into flames. And then it went into the ocean. And then this ending message came up on the screen that said, "Next week, Chapter 2, The Dragon Flies." She sat on the edge of his bed, hands tightly clasped together, her large bosom rising and falling rapidly. "Well," she said, not looking at him, only at the wall. "After that, I hardly saw the movie. I didn't just think about Rocket Man once in a while that next week. I thought about him all the time. How could he have gotten out of it? I couldn't even guess." Next Saturday, I was standing in front of the theater at noon, although the box office didn't open until 1:15, and the movie didn't start until 2. But Paul, what happened? Well, you'll never guess. Paul said nothing, but he could guess. He understood how she could like what he had written and still know it was not right. Know it and say it not with an editor's sometimes untrustworthy literary sophistication, but with constant readers' flat and uncontradictable certainty. He understood and was amazed to find he was ashamed of himself. She was right. He had written a cheat. The new episode always started with the ending of the last one. They showed him going down the hill. They showed the cliff. They showed him banging on the door, trying to open it. Then, just before the car got to the edge, the door banged open, and out he flew onto the road. The car went over the cliff, and all the kids in the theater were cheering because Rocket Man got out. But I wasn't cheering, Paul. I was mad. I started yelling, "That isn't what happened last week. That isn't what happened last week." Annie jumped up and began to walk rapidly back and forth in the room, her head down, her hair flailing in a frizzy cowl about her face, smacking one fist steadily into her other palm, eyes blazing. My brother tried to make me stop, and when I wouldn't, he tried to put his hand over my mouth to shut me up, and I bit it and went on yelling, That isn't what happened last week. Are you all too stupid to remember? Did you all get amnesia?" And my brother said, "You're crazy, Annie." But I knew I wasn't. And the manager came and said if I didn't shut up, I'd have to leave. And I said, "You bet I'm going to leave because that was a dirty cheat. That wasn't what happened last week." She looked at him and Paul saw clear murder in her eyes. He didn't get out of the cockadoodle car. It went over the edge and he was still inside it. Do you understand that? Yes, Paul said. Do you understand that? She suddenly leapt at him with that limber ferocity, and although he felt certain she meant to hurt him as she did before, possibly because she couldn't get at the dirty birdie of a scriptwriter who had cheated Rocket Man out of the Hudson before it went over the cliff, he did not move at all. He could see the seeds of her current instability in the window of past she had just opened for him. But he was also awed by it. The injustice she felt was, in spite of his childishness, completely and arguably real. She didn't hit him. She seized the front of the robe he was wearing and dragged him forward until their faces were nearly touching. Do you? Yes, Annie, yes. She stared at him, that furious black gaze. I must have seen the truth in his face, because after a moment she slung him contemptuously back in the chair. He grimaced against the thick, grinding pain, and after a while it began to subside. Then you know what is wrong, she said. I suppose I do. Although I'll be goddamned if I know how I'm going to fix it. And that other voice returned at once. I don't know if you'll be damned by God or saved by him, Polly. But one thing I do know. If you don't find a way to bring Misery back to life a way she can believe, she's going to kill you. Then do it, she said curtly, and left the room. Let me take another sip. Man, I know you guys probably can't hear it, but like, if the people outside could just like stop honking their horns for like 5 minutes, that would be so good. That would be so great. Actually, let me get a sip of water too. Gotta make sure I have my fluids up. Let's see. Paul looked at the typewriter. The typewriter was there. Ends. He had never realized how many ends there are in an average line of type. I thought you were supposed to be good, the typewriter said. His mind had invested it with a sneering and yet callow voice. The voice of a teenage gunslinger in a Hollywood western. A kid intent on making a fast reputation here in Deadwood. You're not so good. Hell, you can't even please one crazy overweight ex-nurse. Maybe you broke your writing bone in that crash too. Only that bone isn't healing. He leaned back as far as the wheelchair would allow and closed his eyes. A rejection of what he had written. Oh, excuse me. Would be easier to bear if he could blame it on the pain. But the truth was that the pain had finally begun to subside a little. A little. The stolen pills were safely tucked away between the mattress and the box spring. He had taken none of them, knowing he had had them put aside. A form of Annie insurance was enough. She would find them if she took it into her head to turn the mattress, he supposed. That was a chance he was prepared to take. There had been no trouble between them since the blow-up over the typewriter paper. His medication came regularly, and he took it. He wondered if she knew he was hooked on the stuff. Hey, come on now, Paul. That's a bit of a dramatization, isn't it? No, it wasn't. 3 nights ago, when he was sure she was upstairs, he had sneaked one of the sample boxes out and had read everything on the label. Although he supposed he had read everything he needed when he saw what Novral's principal ingredient was. Maybe you spelled relief R0LAIDS, but you spelled Novral CODEINE. The fact is, you're healing up, Paul. Below the knees, your legs look like a 4-year-old stick drawing, but you're healing up. You could get by on aspirin or Emperor now. It's not you that needs the Novril. You're feeding it to the monkey. He would have to cut down, have to duck some of the caps. Until he could do that, she would have him on a chain as well as the wheelchair. A chain of Novril capsules. Okay, I'll duck one of the 2 capsules she gives me every other time she brings them. I'll put it under my tongue when I swallow the other one, then stick it under the mattress with the other pills when she takes the drinking glass out. Only not today. I don't feel ready to start today. I'll start tomorrow. Now in his mind he heard the voice of the Red Queen lecturing Alice. Down here we got our act clean yesterday, and we plan to start getting our act clean tomorrow, but we never clean up our act today. Oh ho, Polly, you're a real riot, the typewriter said in the tough Gunsel's voice he had made up for it. Us dirty birdies are never all that funny, but we never stop trying. You have to give us that, he muttered. Well, you better start thinking about all the dope you're taking, Paul. You better start thinking about it very seriously. He decided suddenly on the spur of the moment that he would start dodging some of the medication as soon as he got a first chapter that Annie liked on paper. A chapter which Annie decided wasn't a cheat. Part of him, the part that listened to even the best, fairest editorial suggestions with ill grace, protested that the woman was crazy, that there was no way to tell what she might or might not accept, that anything he tried would only be a crapshoot. But another part, a far more sensible part, disagreed. He would know the real stuff when he found it. The real stuff would make the crap he had given Annie to read last night. Crap it had taken him 3 days and false starts without numbers to write. Looked like a dog turd sitting next to a silver dollar. Hadn't he known it all was wrong? Hadn't he known it was all wrong? It wasn't like him to labor so painfully, nor to have fill a wastebasket with random jottings or half pages, which ended up with the lines like, Misery turned to him, eyes shining, lips murmuring the magic words, Oh, you numb shithead, this isn't working at all. He had chalked it off to the pain and to being in a situation where he was not just writing for his supper, but for his life. Those ideas had been nothing but plausible lies. The fact was, things had gone badly because he was cheating, and he had known it himself. Well, she saw through you, shit for brains, the typewriter said in its nasty, insolent voice. Didn't she? So what are you going to do now? He didn't know, but he supposed he would have to do something, and in a hurry. He hadn't cared for her mood this morning. He supposed he should count himself lucky that she hadn't re-broken his legs with a baseball bat, or given him a battery acid manicure or something similar to indicate her displeasure when he had begun her book. Such critical responses were always possible, given Annie's unique view of the world. If he got out of this alive, he thought he might drop Christopher Hale a note. Hale reviewed books for the New York Times. The note would say, Whenever my editor called me up and told me you were planning to review one of my books in the Daily Times, my knees used to knock together. You gave me some good ones, Chris, old buddy, but you also torpedoed me more than once, as you well know. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you to go ahead and do your worst. I've discovered a whole new critical mode, my friend. We might call it the Colorado Barbecue and Floor Bucket School of Thought. It makes the stuff you guys do look about as scary as a ride on the Central Park Carousel. This is all very amusing, Paul. Writing critics' little billet doux, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, in one's head is always good for a giggle, but you really ought to find yourself a pot and get it boiling, don't you think? Yes, yes indeed. The typewriter sat there, smirking at him. I hate you, Paul said morosely, and looked out the window. Let me take another sip. The snowstorm to which Paul had awakened the day after his expedition to the bathroom had gone on for 2 days. There had been at least 18 inches of new fall and heavy drifting. By the time the sun finally peered through the clouds again, Annie's Cherokee was nothing but a vague hump in the driveway. Now, however, the sun was out again, and the sky was brilliant once more. The sun had heat as well as brilliance. He could feel it on his face and hands as he sat there. The icicles along the barn were dripping again. He thought briefly of his car in the snow, and then picked up a piece of paper and rolled it into the royal. He typed the words "Misery's Return" in the upper left-hand corner. The number I in the upper right. He banged the carriage return lever 4 or 5 times, centered the carriage, and typed Chapter 1. He hit the keys harder than necessary, so she would be sure to hear he was typing something at least. Now there was all this white space below Chapter 1, looking like a snowbank into which he could fall and die, smothered in frost. Africa. As long as they played fair. That bird came from Africa. There was a parachute under his seat. Africa. Now I must rinse. He was drifting off and knew he shouldn't. If she came in here and caught him cooping instead of writing, she would be mad. But he let himself drift anyway. He was not just dozing. He was, in an odd way, thinking, looking, searching. Searching for what, Polly? But that was obvious. The plane was in a power dive. He was searching for the parachute under the seat. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. When he found the parachute under the seat, it was fair. Maybe not all that realistic, but fair. For a couple of summers, his mother had sent him to day camp at the Malden Community Center. They had played this game. They sat in a circle, and the game was like Annie's chapter plays, and he almost always won. What was that game called? He could see 15 or 20 little boys and girls sitting in a circle in one shady corner of a playground. All of them wearing Malden Community Center t-shirts, all listening intently as the counselor explained how the game was played. Can you? The name of that game was Can You? And it really was just like the Republic Cliffhangers. The game you played then was Can You, Polly? And that's the name of the game now, isn't it? Yes, he supposed it was. In Can You, Counselor would start a story about this guy named Careless Corrigan. Careless was lost in the trackless jungles of South America. Suddenly he looks around and sees there are lions behind him. Lions on either side of him. And by God, lions ahead of him. Careless Corrigan is surrounded by lions. And they're starting to move in. It's only 5 in the afternoon. That is no problem for these kitties. As far as South American lions are concerned, that dinner at 8 shit is for goofballs. Counselor had had a stopwatch, and Paul Sheldon's dozing mind saw it with brilliant clarity. Although he had last held its honest silver weight in his hands more than 30 years ago, he could see the fine copper plate of the numbers, the smaller needle at the bottom which recorded tenths of seconds. He could see the brand name printed in tiny letters, Annex. The counselor would look around the circle and pick one of the day campers. Daniel, he would say, can you? The moment can you was out of his mouth, the counselor would click the stopwatch into motion. Daniel then had exactly 10 seconds to go on with the story. If he did not begin to speak during those 10 seconds, he had to leave the circle. But if he got careless away from the lions, the counselor would look at the circle again and ask the game's other question. One that recalled his current situation clearly to mind again. This question was, did he? The rules for this part of the game were Annie's exactly. Realism was not necessary. Fairness was. Daniel could say, for instance, Luckily, Careless had his Winchester with him and plenty of ammo, so he shot 3 of the lions and the rest ran away. In a case like that, Daniel did. He got the stopwatch and went on with the story, ending his segment with Careless up to his hips in a pool of quicksand or something. And then he would ask someone else if he or she could, and bang down the button on the stopwatch. The 10 seconds wasn't long. It was easy to get jammed up, easy to cheat. The next kid might as well say something like, "Just then, this great big bird, an Andean vulture, I think, flew down. Careless grabbed its neck and made it pull him out of that quicksand." When the counselor asked, "Did she?" you raised your hand if you thought she had, lifted down if you thought she had blown it. In the case of the Andean vulture, the kid would almost surely have been invited to leave the circle. Can you, Paul? Yeah, that's how I survive. That's how come I'm able to maintain homes in both New York and LA, and more rolling iron than there is in some used car lots. Because I can, and it's not something to apologize for, goddammit. There are lots of guys out there who write a better prose line than I do, and who have a better understanding of what people are really like and what humanity is supposed to mean. Hell, I know that. When the counselor asks, "Did he?" about those guys, sometimes only a few people raise their hands. But they raise their hands for me, or for misery. And in the end, I guess they're both the same. Can I? Yeah, you bet I can. There's a million things in this world I can't do. Couldn't hit a curveball even back in high school. Can't fix a leaky faucet. Can't roller skate or make an F chord on the guitar that sounds like anything but shit. I've tried twice to be married and couldn't do it either time. But if you want me to take you away, to scare you, or involve you, or make you cry or grin, yeah, I can. I can bring it to you and keep bringing it until you holler uncle. I'm able. I can. The typewriter's insolent gunslinger voice whispered into this deepening dream. What we got here, friends, is a lot of 2 things. Big talk and white space. Can you? Yes. Yes. Did he? No. He cheated. In Misery's child, the doctor never came. Maybe the rest of you forgot what happened last week, but the stone idol never forgets. Paul has to leave the circle. Pardon me, please. Now I must rinse. Now I must... Rinse, he muttered, and slid over to the right. This dragged his left leg slightly askew, and the bolt of pain in his crushed knee was enough to wake him up. Less than 5 minutes had gone by. He could hear Annie washing dishes in the kitchen. Usually she sang as she did her chores. Today she was not singing. There was only the rattle of plates and the occasional hiss of rinse water. Another bad sign. Here's a special weather bulletin for residents of Sheldon County. A tornado watch is in effect until 5 p.m. tonight. I repeat, a tornado watch. But it was time to stop playing games and get down to business. She wanted Misery back from the dead, but it had to be fair. Not necessarily realistic, just fair. If he could do it this morning, he could just maybe... he could derail the depression he sensed coming on before it could get a real start. Paul looked out the window, his chin on his palm. He was fully awake now, thinking fast and hard, but not really aware of the process. The top 2 or 3 layers of his conscious mind, which dealt with such things as when he last shampooed, or whether or not Annie would be on time with his next dope allotment, seemed to have departed the scene entirely. That part of his head had quietly gone out to get a pastrami on rye or something. There was sensory input, but he was not doing anything with it. Not seeing what he was seeing, not hearing what he was hearing. Another part of him was furiously trying out ideas, rejecting them, trying to combine them, rejecting the combinations. He sensed this was going on but had no direct contact with it, and wanted none. It was dirty down there in the sweatshops. He understood what he was doing now as trying to have an idea. Trying to have an idea wasn't the same thing as getting an idea. Getting an idea was a more humble way of saying I am inspired, or Eureka, my muse has spoken. The idea for fast cars had come to him one day in New York City. He had gone out with no more in mind than buying a VCR for the townhouse on 83rd Street. He had passed a parking lot and had seen an attendant trying to jimmy his way into a car. That was all. He had no idea if what he had seen was licit or illicit, and by the time he had walked another 2 or 3 blocks, he no longer cared. The attendant had become Tony Bonacero. He knew everything about Tony but his name, which he later plucked from a telephone book. Had this story existed full-blown in his mind, half the story existed full-blown in his mind, and the rest was rapidly falling into place. He felt jivey, happy, almost drunk. The muse had arrived, every bit as welcome as an unexpected check in the mail. He had set out to get a video recorder and had gotten something much better instead. He had gotten an idea. This other process, trying to have an idea, was nowhere near as exalted or exalting, but it was every bit as mysterious and every bit as necessary. Because when you were writing a novel, you almost always got roadblocked somewhere, and there was no sense in trying to go on until you'd had an idea. His usual procedure when it was necessary to have an idea was to put on his coat and go for a walk. If he didn't need to have an idea, he took a book when he went for a walk. He recognized walking as good exercise, but it was boring. If you didn't have someone to talk to while you walked, a book was a necessity. But if you needed to have an idea, boredom could be to a roadblocked novel what chemotherapy was to a cancer patient. Halfway through Fast Cars, Tony had killed Lieutenant Gray when the lieutenant tried to slap the cuffs on him in a Times Square movie theater. Paul wanted Tony to get away with the murder, for a while anyway, because there could be no third act with Tony sitting in the cooler. Yet Tony could not simply leave Gray sitting in the movie theater with the half of a knife sticking out of his left armpit, because there were at least 3 people who knew Gray had gone to meet Tony. Body disposal was the problem, and Paul didn't know how to solve it. It was a roadblock. It was the game. It was careless, just killed this guy in a Times Square movie theater, and now he's got to get the body back to his car without anyone saying, "Hey, mister, is that guy as dead as he looks, or did he just pitch a fit or something?" If he gets Gray's corpse back to the car, he can drive it to Queens and dump it in this abandoned building project he knows about. Polly, can you? There was no 10-second deadline, of course. He'd had no contract for the book, had written it on spec, and hence there was no delivery date to think about. Yet there was always a deadline, a time after which you had to leave the circle, and most writers knew it. If a book remained roadblocked long enough, it began to decay, to fall apart. All the little tricks and illusions started to show. He had gone for a walk thinking of nothing on top of his mind, the way he was thinking of nothing on top right now. He had walked 3 miles before someone set up a flare from the sweatshops down below. Suppose he starts a fire in the theater? That looked like it might work. There was no sense of giddiness, no true feeling of inspiration. He felt like a carpenter looking at a piece of lumber that might do the job. He could set a fire in the stuffing of the seat next to him. How's that? Goddamn seats in those theaters are always torn up, and there'd be smoke. Lots of it. He could hold off leaving as long as possible, then drag Gray out with him. He can pass Gray off as a smoke inhalation victim. What do you think? He thought it was okay. Not great, and there were plenty of details still to be worked out, but it looked okay. He'd had an idea. The work could proceed. He'd never needed to have an idea to start a book, but he'd understood instinctively that it could be done. He sat quietly in the chair, chin on hand, looking out at the barn. If he'd been able to walk, he would have been out there in the field. He sat quietly, almost dozing, waiting for something to happen. Really aware of nothing at all except that things were happening down below. Whole edifices of make-believe were being erected, judged, found wanting, and torn down again in the wink of an eye. 10 minutes passed. 15. Now she was running the vacuum cleaner in the parlor, but still not singing. He heard it, but did nothing with the hearing of it. It was unconnected sound which ran into his head and then out again like water running through a flume. Finally, the guys down below shot up a flare, as they always eventually did. Poor buggers down there never stopped busting their chops, and he didn't envy them one little bit. Paul sat quietly, beginning to have an idea. His conscious mind returned. The doctor is in, and picked the idea up like a letter pushed through the mail slot in a door. He began to examine it. He almost rejected it. Was that a faint groan from down there in the sweatshops? Reconsidered. Decided half of it could be saved. A second flare. This one brighter than the first. Paul began to drum his fingers restlessly on the windowsill. Around 11 o'clock he began to type. This went very slowly at first. Individual clacks followed by spaces of silence. Some as long as 15 seconds. It was the oral equivalent of an island archipelago seen from the air. A chain of low humps broken by broad swaths of blue. Little by little, the spaces of silence began to shorten. Now there were occasional bursts of typing. It would have sounded fine on Paul's electric typewriter, but the clacking sound of the Royal was thick, actively unpleasant. But after a while, Paul did not notice the Ducky Daddle's voice of the typewriter. He was warming up by the bottom of the first page. By the bottom of the second, he was in high gear. After a while, Annie turned off the vacuum cleaner and stood in the doorway watching him. Paul had no idea she was there. Had no idea, in fact, that he was. He had finally escaped. He was in Little Dunthorpe's churchyard, breathing damp night air, smelling moss and earth and mist. He heard the clock in the tower of the Presbyterian church strike 2, and dumped it into the story without missing a beat. When it was very good, he could see through the paper. He could see through it now. Annie watched him for a long time, her heavy face unsmiling, moveless, but somehow satisfied. After a while, she went away. Her tread was heavy, but Paul didn't hear that either. He worked until 3 o'clock that afternoon, and at 8 that night he asked her to help him back into the wheelchair again. He wrote another 3 hours, although by 10 o'clock the pain had begun to be quite bad. Annie came in at 11. He asked for another 15 minutes. No, Paul, it's enough. You're white as salt. She got him into bed and he was asleep in 3 minutes. He slept the whole night through for the first time since coming out of the gray cloud. and his sleep was for the first time utterly without dreams. He'd been dreaming awake. Misery's Return by Paul Sheldon for Annie Wilkes. Chapter 1. For a moment, Geoffrey Oliverton was not sure who the old man at the door was. And this was not entirely because the bell had awakened him from a deepening doze. The irritating thing about village life, he thought, was that there weren't enough people for there to be any perfect strangers. Instead, there were just enough to keep one from knowing immediately who many of the villagers were. Sometimes all one really had to go on was a family's resemblance. And such resemblances, of course, never precluded the unlikely but hardly impossible coincidence of bastardy. One could usually handle such moments, no matter how much one might feel one was entering one's dotage, while trying to maintain an ordinary conversation with a person whose name one should be able to recall but could not. Things only reached the more cosmic realms of embarrassment when two such familiar faces arrived at the same time, and one felt called upon to make introductions. "I hope I'll not be disturbing ye, sire," the visitor said. He was twisting a cheap cloth cap restlessly in his hands, and in the light cast by the lamp Geoffrey held up, his face looked lined and yellow and terribly worried, frightened even. "It's just that I didn't want to go back to Dr. Bookings, nor did I want to disturb his lordship. Not at least until I'd spoken to you, if you take my meaning, sire." Geoffrey didn't, but quite suddenly he did know one thing: who this late-coming visitor was. The mention of Dr. Bookings, the C of E minister, had done it. 3 days ago, Dr. Bookings had performed Misery's last rites in the churchyard, which lay behind the rectory, and this fellow had been there, but lurking considerately in the background, where he was less apt to be noticed. His name was Coulter. He was one of the church sextons. To be brutally frank, the man was a gravedigger. "Coulter," he said, "what can I do for you?" Coulter spoke hesitantly. "It's the noises, sire. The noises in the churchyard. Her ladyship rests not easy, sire. So she doesn't. And I'm afeard. Geoffrey felt as if someone had punched him in the midsection. He pulled in a gasp of air and hot pain needled his side, where his ribs had beers tightly taped by Dr. Shinebone. Shinebone's gloomy assessment had been that Geoffrey would almost certainly take pneumonia after lying in that ditch all night in the chilly rain. But 3 days had passed and there had been no onset of fever and coughing. He had known there would not be. God did not let off the guilty so easily. He believed that God would let him live to perpetuate his poor lost darling's memory for a long, long time. "Are you all right, sire?" Coulter asked. "I heard you were terrible bunged up the other night." He paused. "The night herself died." "I'm fine," Geoffrey said slowly. "Coulter, these sounds you say you hear, you know they are just imaginings, don't you?" Coulter looked shocked. "Imaginings?" he said. "Sire, next you'll be telling me you have no belief in Jesus and the life everlasting. Why, didn't Duncan Fromsley see old man Patterson not 2 days after his funeral, glowing just as white as marsh fire?" Which was just what it probably was, Geoffrey thought. Marsh fire plus whatever came out of old Fromsley's last bottle. And ain't half the bleedin' town seen that old papist monk that walks the battlements of Ridge Heath Manor? They even sent down a couple of ladies from the bleedin' London Psychic Society to look into that and... Joffrey knew the ladies Coulter meant. A couple of hysterical beldams, probably suffering from the alternate calms and monsoons of midlife, both as dotty as a child's draw-it-name-it puzzle. Ghosts are just as real as you or me, sire, Coulter was saying earnestly. I don't mind the idea of them, but these noises are fearsome, spooky, so they are. I hardly even like to go near the churchyard. And I have to dig a grave for the little Roydman babe tomorrow, so I do. Joffrey said an inward prayer for patience. The urge to bellow at this poor sexton was almost insurmountable. He had been dozing peacefully enough in front of his own fire with a book in his lap when Coulter came waking him up. And he was coming more and more awake all the time. And at every second the dull sorrow settled more deeply over him. The awareness that his darling was gone. She was 3 days in her grave, soon to be a week, a month, a year, 10 years. The sorrow, he thought, was like a rock on the shoreline of the ocean. When one was sleeping, it was as if the tide... Okay, Did that pick up on the mic? People are so fucking loud out here. God. Okay, where was I? Well, okay. The sorrow, he thought, was like a rock on the shoreline of the ocean. When one was sleeping, it was as if the tide was in, and there was some relief. Sleep was like a tide which covered the rock of grief. When one woke, however, the tide began to go out, and soon the rock was visible again. A barnacle-encrusted thing of inarguable reality. A thing which would be there forever, or until God chose to wash it away. And this fool dared to come here and prate of ghosts. But the man's face looked so wretched that Joffrey was able to control himself. Miss Misery, her ladyship, was much loved, Joffrey said quietly. Aye, sire, so she was, Coulter agreed fervently. He switched custody of his cloth cap to his left hand solely, and with his right produced a giant red handkerchief from his pocket. He honked mightily into it, his eyes watering. All of us sorrow at her passing. Joffrey's hands went to his shirt and rubbed the heavy muslin wrappings beneath it, restlessly. Aye, so we do, sire, so we do. Coulter's words were muffled in the handkerchief, but Joffrey could see his eyes. The man was really, honestly weeping. The last of his own selfish anger dissolved in pity. She were a good lady, sire. Aye, she were a great lady, and it is a terrible thing the way his lordship took on about it. Aye, she was fine, Joffrey said gently, and found to his dismay that his own tears were now close, like a cloudburst which threatens on a late summer's afternoon. And sometimes, Coulter, when someone especially fine passes away, someone especially dear to us all, we find it hard to let this someone go. So we may imagine that they have not gone. Do you follow me? Aye, sire, Coulter said eagerly. But these sounds... Sire, if ye heard them... Patiently, Joffrey said. What sort of sounds do you mean? He thought Coulter would then speak of sounds which might be no more than the wind of the trees. Sounds amplified by his own imagination, of course. Or perhaps a badger bumbling its way down to Old Dunthorpe stream, which lay behind the churchyard. And so he was hardly prepared when Coulter whispered in an affrighted voice. Scratching sound, sire. It sounds as if she were still alive down there, and trying to work her way back up to the land of the living, so it does. 15 minutes later, alone again, Joffrey approached the dining room sideboard. He was reeling from side to side like a man negotiating the foredeck of a ship in a gale. He felt like a man in a gale. He might have believed that the fever Dr. Shinebone had almost gleefully predicted had come on him at last, and with a vengeance. But it wasn't fever which had simultaneously brought wild red roses to his cheeks and tugged his forehead to the color of candle wax. Not fever which made his hands shake so badly that he almost dropped the decanter of brandy as he brought it out of the sideboard. If there was a chance, the slightest chance, that the monstrous idea Coulter had planted in his mind was true, then he had no business pausing here at all. But he felt that without a drink he might fall swooning to the floor. Geoffrey Alberton did something that he had never done before in his whole life. Something he clever did again. He lifted the decanter directly to his mouth and drank from the neck. Then he stepped back and whispered, "We shall see about this. We shall see about this, by heaven. And if I go on this insane errand only to discover nothing at the end of it but an old grave digger's imagination after all, I will have Goodman Coulter's earlobes on my watch chain, no matter how much he loved misery." He took the pony trap, driving under an eerie, not quite dark sky, where a three-quarters moon ducked restlessly in and out between racing reefs of cloud. He paused to throw on the first thing in the downstairs hall closet which came to hand. This turned out to be a dark maroon smoking jacket. The tails blew about behind him as he whipped Mary on. The elderly mare did not like the speed upon which he was insisting. Geoffrey did not like the deepening pain in his shoulder and side, but the pain of neither could be helped. "Scratch and sound, sire. It sounds as if she were still alive down there, and trying to work her way back up to the land of the living." This by itself would not have put him in a state of near terror, but he remembered coming to Calthorpe Manor the day after Misery's death. He and Ian had looked at each other, and Ian had tried to smile, although his eyes were gem-like with unshed tears. It would somehow be easier, Ian had said, if she looked more dead. "I know how that sounds." "Bosh," Geoffrey had said, trying to smile. The Undertaker doubtless exercised all his wit and... "Undertaker," Ian nearly screamed. And for the first time, Geoffrey had truly understood that his friend was tottering on the brink of madness. Undertaker. Fool. I've had no Undertaker, and I will have no Undertaker to come in and rouge my darling and paint her like a doll. Ian, my dear fellow, really, you mustn't. Geoffrey had made as if to clap Ian on the shoulder, and somehow that had turned into an embrace. Two men wept in each other's arms like tired children, while in some other room Misery's child, a boy now almost a day old and still unnamed, awoke and began to cry. Mrs. Ramage, I guess it was Ramage. I was saying Rampage for some reason. Mrs. Ramage, whose own kindly heart was broken, began to sing it a cradle song in a voice cracked and full of tears. At the same time, deeply afraid for Ian's sanity, he had been less concerned with what Ian had said than how he had said it. Only now, as he whipped Mary even faster towards little Dunthorpe, in spite of his own deepening pain, did the words come back, haunting in light of Coulter's tale. If she looked more dead. If she looked more dead, old chap. Nor was that all. Late that afternoon, as the first of the village people had begun wending their way up Calthorpe Hill to pay their respects to the grieving lord, Shinebone had returned. He looked tired, not very well himself. Nor was this surprising in a man who had claimed to have shaken hands with Wellington, the Iron Duke himself, when he, Shinebone, not Wellington, had been a boy. Joffrey thought the Wellington story was probably an exaggeration, but old Shinny, as he and Tan had called him as boys, had seen Joffrey through all his childhood illnesses. Joffrey through all his childhood illnesses, and Shinny had seemed a very old man to him even then, always granting the eye of childhood, which tends to see anyone over the age of 25 as elderly. He thought Shinny must be 11 of 75 now. He was old. He'd had a hectic, terrible last 24 hours. And might not an old, tired Mortal have made a mistake? A terrible, unspeakable mistake? It was this thought more than any other which had set him out on this cold and windy night, under a moon which stuttered uncertainly between the clouds. Could he have made such a mistake? Part of him, a craven, cowardly part, which would rather risk losing misery forever than look upon the inevitable results of such a mistake, denied it. But when Shinny came in, Joffrey had been sitting by Ian, who was remembering in a broken, scarcely coherent way how he and Ian had rescued Misery from the palace dungeons of the mad French Viscount Leroux, how they had escaped in a wagon load of hay, and how Misery distracted one of the Viscount's guards at a critic's moment by slipping one gorgeously unclad leg out of the hay and waving it delicately. Joffrey had been chiming in his own memories of the adventure, fully in the grip of his grief by then, and he cursed that grief now. And he cursed that grief how, because of him, and to Ian as well, he supposed. Shinny had barely been there. Hadn't Shinny seemed strangely distant, strangely preoccupied? Was it only weariless, or had it been something else? Something suspicious? No, surely not, his mind protested uneasily. The pony trap was flying up Calthorpe Hill. The manor house itself was dark, but good. There was still a single light on in Miss Ramage's cottage. I kind of lost my place there. "Up, Mary," he cried, and cracked the whip, wincing. "Not much farther, girl, and you can rest a bit." Surely not what you're thinking. But Shinny's examination of Joffrey's broken ribs and sprained shoulder had seemed purely perfunctory, and he had spoken barely a word to Ian, in spite of the man's deep grief and frequent incoherent cries. No, after a visit which now seemed no longer than the most minimal sort of social convention would demand, Shinny had asked quietly, "Is she—" "Yes, in the parlor," Ian had managed. "My poor darling lies in the parlor. Kiss her for me, Shinny, and tell her I'll be with her soon." Ian then had burst into tears again, and after muttering some half-heard word of condolence, Shinny had passed into the parlor. It now seemed to Joffrey that the old Sawbones had been in there for a rather long time, or perhaps that was only faulty recollection. But when he came out, he looked almost cheerful, and there was nothing faulty about this recollection, Joffrey felt sure. That expression was too out of place in that room of grief and tears, a room where Miss Ramage had already hung the black funerary curtains. Joffrey had followed the old doctor, but out. It's a typo. They didn't write this very well. Joffrey had followed the old doctor out and spoke hesitantly to him in the kitchen. He hoped, he said, that the doctor would prescribe a sleeping powder for Ian, who really did seem quite ill. Shinny had seemed completely distracted, however. "It's not a bit like Miss Evelyn Hyde," he said. "I have satisfied myself of that." and he had returned to his caleche without so much as a response to Geoffrey's question. Geoffrey went back inside, already forgetting the doctor's otter mark, already chalking Shinny's equally odd behavior off to age, weariness, and his own sort of grief. His thoughts had turned to Ian again, and he determined that with no sleeping powder forthcoming, he would simply have to pour whiskey down Ian's throat until the poor fellow passed out, forgetting, dismissing, until now. It's not a bit like Miss Evelyn Hyde. I have satisfied myself of that. Of what? Geoffrey did not know, but he intended to find out, no matter what the cost to his sanity might be, and he recognized that the cost might be high. Mrs. Ramage was still up when Geoffrey began to hammer on the cottage door, although it was already 2 hours past her normal bedtime. Since Misery had passed away, Mrs. Ramage found herself putting her bedtime further and further back. If she could have put an end to her restless tossing and turning, she could at least postpone the moment at which she began it. Although she was the most level-headed and practical of women, the sudden outburst of knocking startled a little scream from her, and she scalded herself with the hot milk she had been pouring from pot to cup. Lately she seemed always on edge, always on the verge of a scream. It was not grief, this feeling, although she was nearly overwhelmed with grief. This was a strange, thundery feeling that she couldn't ever remember having before. It sometimes seemed to her that thoughts better left unrecognized were circling around her, just beyond the grasp of her weary, bitterly sad mind. "Who knocks at 10?" she cried at the door. "Whoever it is, I thank ye not for the burn I have given myself." "It's Geoffrey, Mrs. Ramage. Geoffrey Oliverton. Open the door, for God's sake." Mrs. Ramage's mouth dropped open, and she was halfway to the door before she remembered she was in her nightgown and cap. She had never heard Geoffrey sound so, and would not have believed it if someone had told her of it. If there was a man in all England with a heart stouter than that of her beloved milord, then it was Geoffrey. Yet his voice trembled like the voice of a woman on the verge of hysterics. "A minute, Mr. Geoffrey. I'm half unclad." "Devil take it," Geoffrey cried. "I don't care if you're starkers, Mrs. Ramage. Open this door. Open it in the name of Jesus." She stood only a second, then went to the door, unbarred it, and threw it open. Geoffrey's look did more than stun her, and again she heard the dim thunder of black thoughts somewhere back in her head. Geoffrey stood on the threshold of this housekeeper's cottage, in an odd slanting posture, as if his spine had been warped out of shape by long years carrying a peddler's sack. His right hand was pressed between his left arm and left side. His hair was in a tangle. His dark brown eyes burned out of his white face. His dress was remarkable for one as careful, dandified, some would have said, about his clothing as Geoffrey Oliverton usually was. He wore an old smoking jacket with the belt askew, an open-throated white shirt, and a pair of rough serge pants that would have looked more at home upon the legs of an Oh, Jesus Christ. Thank you for the follow. What's your name? Erica? Thank you, Erica. Okay. A pair of rough serge pants that would have looked more at home upon the legs of an itinerant gardener than upon those of the richest man in Little Dunthorpe. On his feet were a pair of threadbare slippers. Mrs. Ramage, hardly dressed for a court ball herself in her long white nightgown and muskrat's nightcap with the untied curling ribbons hanging around her face like the fringe on a lampshade, stared at him with mounting concern. He had re-injured the ribs he had broken riding after the doctor 3 nights ago. That was obvious. But it wasn't just the pain that made his eyes blaze from his whitened face like that. It was terror, barely held in check. Mr. Joffrey, what? No questions, he said hoarsely. Not yet. Not until you answer one question of my own. What question? She was badly frightened now, her left hand clenched into a tight fist just above her munificent bosom. Does the name Miss Evelyn Hyde mean anything to you? And suddenly she knew the reason for that terrible thundery feeling that had been inside her ever since Saturday night. Some part of her mind must already have had this gruesome thought and suppressed it, for she needed no explanation at all. Only the name of the unfortunate Miss Charlotte Evelyn Hyde, late of Storping-on-Firkil, the village just to the west of Little Dunthorpe, was sufficient to bring a scream tearing from her. Oh, my saints! Oh, my dear Jesus! Has she been buried alive? Has she been buried alive? Has my darling Misery been buried alive? And now, before Joffrey could even begin to answer, it was tough old Mrs. Ramage's turn to do something she had never done before that night and would never do again. She fainted dead away. Joffrey had no time to look for smelling salts. He doubted if such an old soldier as Mrs. Ramage kept them around anyway. But beneath her sink he found a rag, which smelled faintly of ammonia. He did not just pass this beneath her nose, but pressed it briefly against her lower face. The possibility Coulter had raised, however faint, was too hideous to merit much in the way of consideration. She jerked, cried out, and opened her eyes. For a moment she looked at him with dazed, uncomprehending bewilderment. Then she sat up. "No," she said. "No, Mr. Joffrey. Say you don't mean it. Say it isn't true." "I don't know if it is true or not," he said. "But we must satisfy ourselves immediately. Immediately, Mrs. Ramage. I can't do all the digging myself. If there's digging that must be done." She was staring at him with horrified eyes, her hands pressed so tightly over her mouth that the nails were white. "Can you help me if help is needed? There's really no one else." "My lord," she said numbly. "My lord, Mr. Ian." "Must know nothing of this until we know more," he said. "If God is good, he need never know at all." He would not voice to her the unspoken hope at the back of his mind, a hope which seemed to him almost as monstrous as his fears. If God was very good, he would find out about this night's work. When his wife and only love was restored to him, her return from the dead almost as miraculous as that of Lazarus. "Oh God, this is terrible, terrible," she said in a faint, fluttery voice. Holding on to the table, she managed to pull herself to her feet. She stood, swaying, little straggles of her hair hanging about her face among the muskrat tails of her cap. "Are you well enough?" he asked more kindly. "If not, then I must try to carry on as best as I can by myself." She drew a deep, shuddering breath and let it out. Side to side sway stopped. She turned and walked toward the pantry. "There's a pair of spades in the shed out back," she said. "A pick as well, I think. Throw them in your trap. There's half a bottle of gin out here in the pantry. Been here untouched since Bill died 5 years ago on Lammas night. I'll have a bit and then join you, Mr. Joffrey." "You're a brave woman, Mrs. Ramage. Be quick." "I never fear me," she said, and grasped the bottle of gin with a hand that trembled only slightly. There was no dust on the bottle. Not even the pantry was safe from the relentless dust cloud of Mrs. Ramage. But the label reading "Cloth and Poor Bougiers" was yellow. "Be quick yourself." She had always hated spirits and her stomach wanted to sick the gin. With its nasty junipery, hey, that's my name, junipery smell and oily taste back up. She made it stay down. Tonight she would need it. Under clouds that still raced east to west, blacker shapes against a black sky, and a moon that was now setting toward the horizon, the pony trap sped toward the churchyard. It was now Mrs. Ramage who drove, cracking the whip over the bewildered Mary, who would have told them, if horses could talk, that this was all wrong. She was supposed to be dozing in her warm stall come this time of night. The spades and pick chattered coldly one against the other, and Mrs. Ramage thought they would have given anyone who'd seen them a proper fright. They must look like a pair of Mr. Dickens's resurrection men, or perhaps one resurrection man sitting in a pony trap driven by a ghost. For she was all in white, and not even paused long enough to gather up her robe. Her nightgown fluttered around her stout, vein-puffed ankles, and the tails of her cap streamed wildly out behind her. Here was the church. She turned Mary up the lane which ran beside it, shivering at the ghostly sound of the wind playing along the eaves. She had a moment to wonder why such a holy place as a church should seem so frightening after dark, and then realized it was not the church, it was the errand. Her first thought upon coming out of her faint was that my lord must help them. Hadn't he been there in all things, through thick and thin, never wavering? A moment later she had realized how mad the idea was. This was not a matter of my lord's courage, but of his very sanity. She hadn't needed Mr. Joffrey to tell her so. The memory of Miss Evelyn Hyde had done that. She realized that neither Mr. Joffrey nor my lord had been in Little Dunthorpe when it had happened. This had been almost half a year ago in the spring. Misery had entered the rosy summer of her pregnancy, morning sickness behind her, the final rising of her belly, and its attendant discomfort still ahead, and she had cheerfully sent the two men off for a week of grouse shooting and card playing and footballing, and heaven alone knew what other masculine foolishness at Oak Hall and Doncaster. My lord had been a bit doubtful, but Misery assured him she would be fine, and nearly pushed him out the door. That Misery would be fine, Miss Ramage had no doubt, but whenever my lord and Mr. Joffrey left for Doncaster, she wondered if one of them, or perhaps both, might not return on the back of the cart, toes up. Oak Hall was the inheritance of Albert Fossington, a schoolmate of Joffrey's and Ian's. Mrs. Ramage quite rightly believed that Bertie Fossington was mad. Some 3 years ago he had eaten his favorite polo pony after it had broken 2 legs and needed to be destroyed. It was in a gesture of affection, he said. Learned it from the fuzzy wuzzies in Cape Town, he said. Greekas, wonderful chaps, put sticks and things in their smoochers, what? Some of them look like they could carry all 12 volumes of the Royal Navigation charts on their lower lips. Taught me that each man must eat the thing he loves. Rather poetic in a grisly sort of way, what? In spite of such bizarre behavior, Mr. Joffrey and my lord retained a great affection for Bertie. I wonder if that means they'll have to eat him when he's dead, Mrs. Ramage had once wondered after a visit from Bertie, during which he had tried to play croquet with one of the house cats, quite shattering its poor little head. And they had spent nearly 10 days at Oak Hall this past spring. Not more than a day or 2 after they left, Miss Charlotte Evelyn Hyde of Storping-on-Firkle had been found dead on the back lawn of her home, Cove o' Birches. There had been a freshly picked bunch of flowers near one outstretched hand. The village doctor was a man named Bilford, a capable man by all accounts. Nevertheless, he had called old Dr. Shinebone in to consult. Bilford had diagnosed the fatal malady as a heart attack, although the girl was very young, only 18, and it seemed in the pink of health. Bilford was puzzled. Something seemed not at all right. Old Shinny had been clearly puzzled as well, but in the end he had concurred with the diagnosis. So did most of the village, for that matter. The girl's heart had not been properly made, that was all. Such things were rare, but everyone could recall such a sad case at one time or another. It was probably this universal concurrence that had saved Bilford's practice, if not his head. Following the ghastly denouement, I'm not sure what that means. We'll be fine. Okay, we're taking some more sips. Okay. You know, I was so in the zone. I noticed that my tea it went cold, but I'll still drink like the last bit of it. Oh, and we're doing snacks tonight? Well, I actually cut up some apples. There were actually apples like on sale last week for like 90 cents a pound, and they had like big, like huge bags of them, so I bought a couple. I mean, obviously I'm only having a little bit because we still have like reading to do. Alright, now where were we? Let's see. Although everyone had agreed the girl's death was puzzling, it had crossed no one's mind that she might not be dead at all. 4 days following the interment, an elderly woman named Mrs. Soames, Mrs. Rainage knew her slightly, had observed something white lying on the ground of the Congregational Church's cemetery as she entered it, to put flowers on the grave of her husband who had died that previous winter. It was much too big to be a flower petal, and she thought it might be a dead bird of some sort. As she approached, she became more and more sure that the white object was not just lying on the ground, but protruding from it. She came 2 or 3 hesitant steps closer yet, and observed a hand reaching from the earth of a fresh grave, the fingers frozen in a hideous gesture of supplication. Blood-streaked bones protruded from the ends of all the digits save the thumb. Mrs. Soames ran shrieking from the cemetery, ran all the way into Storping's High Street, a run of nearly 1.25 miles, and reported her news to the barber, who was also the local constable. Then she had collapsed in a dead faint. She took to her bed later that afternoon and did not arise from it for nearly a month, nor did anyone in the village blame her in the least. The body of the unfortunate Miss Evelyn Hyde had been exhumed, of course, and as Geoffrey Oliverton drew Mary to a halt in front of the gate leading up to Little Dunthorpe's C of E churchyard, Mrs. Ramage found herself wishing fervently that she had not listened to the tales of the exhumation. They had been dreadful. Dr. Bilford, shaken to within an inch of sanity himself, diagnosed catalepsy. The poor woman had apparently fallen into some sort of death-like trance, much like the sort those Indian fakers could voluntarily induce in themselves before allowing themselves to be buried alive, or to have needles pass through their flesh. She had remained in this trance for perhaps 48 hours, perhaps 60. Long enough, at any rate, to have awakened, not to find herself on the back lawn, where she had been picking flowers, but buried alive in her own coffin. She had fought grimly for her life, that girl, and Mrs. Ramage found now, following Geoffrey through the gates and into a thin mist that turned the leaning grave markers into islands, that what should have redeemed with nobility only made it seem all the more horrid. The girl had been engaged to be married. In her left hand, not the one frozen above the soil like the hand of a drowned woman, had been her diamond engagement ring. With it, she had slit the satin lining of her coffin, and over God knew how many hours, she had used it to claw away at the coffin's wooden lid. In the end, ere running out, she had apparently used the ring with her left hand to cut and excavate, and her right hand to dig. It had not been quite enough. Her complexion had been a deep purple, from which her blood-rimmed eyes stared in a bulging expression of terminal horror. The clock in the church tower began to chime the hour of 12. The hour when, her mother had told her, the door between life and death sways open a bit, and the dead may pass both ways. And it was all Mrs. Ramage could do to keep herself from shrieking and fleeing in a panic which would not abate but grow stronger with each step. Oh, excuse me. If she began running, she knew. She would simply run until she fell down insensible. Stupid, fearful woman, she berated herself, and then amended that to stupid, fearful, selfish woman. It's my lord ye want to be thinking of now, and not your own fears, my lord. And if there is even one chance that my lady... but no. It was madness to even think of such a thing. It had been too long, too long, too long. Geoffrey had led her to Misery's tombstone, and the two of them stood looking down at it, as if mesmerized. Lady Calthorpe, the stone read. Other than the dates of her birth and death, the only inscription was, "Loved by many." She looked at Geoffrey and said, like one awakening from a deep daze, "You've not brought the tools." "No, not yet," he responded, and threw himself full length on the ground and placed his ear against the earth, which had already began to show the first tender roots of new grass between the rather carelessly replaced sods. For a moment, the only expression she saw there by the lamp she carried was the one Geoffrey had worn since she had first opened her door to him, a look of agonized dread. Then a new expression began to surface. This new expression was one of utter horror mingled with an almost demented hope. He looked up at Mrs. Ramage, eyes staring, mouth working. I believe she lives," he whispered strengthlessly. "Oh, Mrs. Ramage." Suddenly he turned over onto his belly and screamed at the ground. Under other circumstances it would have been comic. "Misery, Misery, we're here, we know. Hold on, my darling." He was on his feet a moment later, sprinting back toward the pony trap where the digging tools were, his slippered feet sending the placid ground mist into excited little royals. Mrs. Ramage's knees unlocked and she buckled forward, near to swooning again. Of its own accord, seemingly, her head slipped to one side, so her right ear was pressed against the ground. She had seen children in similar postures by the railway line, listening for trains. And she heard it. Low, painful, scraping sounds in the earth. Not the sounds of a burrowing animal, these. These were the sounds of fingers scraping helplessly on wood. She drew in breath, in one great convulsive gulp, restarting her own heart, it seemed. She shrieked, "We're coming, my lady! Praise God and plead sweet Jesus we be in time. We're coming." She began to pull half-heaved turves out of the ground with her trembling fingers, and Joffrey returned in almost no time. She had by then already clawed a wholesome 8 inches deep. No, I really, I really hate the way that the like fictional book in this is written. We're back to like the main story now. He was already 9 pages into chapter 7. Joffrey and Mrs. Ramage had managed to get Misery out of her grave in the barest nick of time, only to realize that the woman had no idea at all who they were, or who she herself was, when Annie came into the room. This time Paul heard her. He stopped typing, sorry to be out of the dream. She held the first 6 chapters at the side of her skirt. It had taken her less than 20 minutes to read his first stab at it. It had only been an hour since she had taken the sheaf of 21 pages. He looked at her steadily, observing with faint interest that Annie Wilkes was a bit pale. "Well," he asked, "is it fair?" "Yes," she said absently, as if this was a foregone conclusion, and Paul supposed it was. "It's fair, and it's good. Exciting. But it's gruesome, too. It's not like any of the other Misery books. That poor woman who scraped the ends of her fingers off." She shook her head and repeated, "It's not like any of the other Misery books." The man who wrote these pages was in a rather gruesome frame of mind, my dear, Paul thought. "Shall I go on?" he asked. "I'll kill you if you don't," she responded, smiling a little. Paul didn't smile back. This comment, which would once have struck him as in a league with such banalities as "you look so good I could just eat you up," now seemed not banal at all. Yet something in her attitude as she stood in the doorway fascinated him. It was as if she was a little frightened to come any closer, as if she thought something in him might burn her. It wasn't the subject of premature burial that had done it, and he was wise enough to know it. No, it was the difference between his first try and this one. That first one had all the life of an 8th grader's "how I spent my summer vacation" theme. This one was different. The furnace was on. Oh, not that he had written particularly well, the story was hot. But the characters as stereotyped and predictable as ever. But this time he had been able to at least generate some power. This time there was heat baking out from between the lines. Amused, he thought. She felt the heat. I think she's afraid to get in too close in case I might burn her. "Well," he said mildly, "you won't have to kill me, Annie. I want to go on. So why don't I get back at it?" "All right," she said. She brought the pages to him, put them on the board, and then stepped back quickly. "Would you like to read it as I go along?" he asked. Annie smiled. "Yes, it would be almost like the chapter plays when I was a kid." "Well, I can't promise a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter," he said. "It just doesn't work that way." "It will for me," she said fervently. "I'd want to know what was going to happen in chapter 18, even if 17 ended with Misery and Ian and Joffrey sitting in armchairs on the porch reading newspapers. I'm already wild to know what's going to happen next. Don't tell me," she added sharply, as if Paul had offered to do this. "Well, I generally don't show my work until it's all done," he said, and then smiled at her. "But since this is a special situation, I'll be happy to let you read it chapter by chapter." And so began the 1001 Nights of Paul Sheldon, he thought. "But I wonder if you'd do something for me." "What?" "Fill in these damned ends," he said. She smiled at him radiantly. "It would be an honor. I'll leave you alone now." She went back to the door, hesitated there, and turned back. Then, with a deep and almost painful timidity, she offered the only editorial suggestion she ever made to him. Maybe it was a B. He had already dropped his gaze to the sheet of paper in the typewriter. He was looking for the hole. He wanted to get Misery back to Mrs. Ramage's cottage before he knocked off, and he looked back up at Annie with carefully disguised impatience. "I beg your pardon?" "A B," she said, and he saw a blush creeping up her neck and over her cheeks. Soon even her ears were glowing. One person in every dozen is allergic to bee venom. I saw lots of cases of it before I retired from service as an RN. The allergy can show in lots of different ways. Sometimes a sting can cause a comatose condition, which is similar to what people used to call catalepsy. Now she was so red she was almost purple. Paul held up the idea briefly in his mind and then tossed it on the scrap heap. A bee could have been the cause of Mrs. Evelyn's unfortunate live burial. It even made sense since it happened in mid-spring, in the garden to boot. But he had already decided that credibility depended on the two live burials being related somehow, and Misery had succumbed in her bedroom. The fact that late fall was hardly bee season was not really the problem. The problem was the rarity of the cataleptic reaction. He thought Constant Reader would not swallow two unrelated women in neighboring townships being buried alive 6 months apart as a result of bee stings. Yet he could not tell Annie that. And not just because it might rile her up. He could not tell her because it would hurt her badly. And in spite of all the pain she had afforded him, he found he could not hurt her in that way. He had been hurt that way himself. He fell back on that most common writer's workshop euphemism. It's got possibilities, alright. I'll drop it into the hopper, Annie, but I've already got some ideas in mind. They may not fit. Oh, I know that. You're the writer, not me. Just forget I said anything. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. But she was gone. Her heavy tread almost running down the hallway to the parlor. He was looking at an empty space. His eyes dropped, then widened. Oh, I'm trying to swallow, but my throat's dry. On either side of the doorway, about 8 inches up from the floor, was a black mark. They had been left, he understood at once, by the hubs of the wheelchair when he forced it through. So far, she hadn't noticed them. It had been almost a week, and her failure to notice was a small miracle. But soon, tomorrow, perhaps even this afternoon, she would begin to vacuum. And then she would. She would. Paul managed very little during the rest of the day. The hole in the paper disappeared. I think I'm gonna do like one more chapter, and then let's see how many pages this is. Yeah, we could do like one more chapter before I wrap up tonight. I think going forward we definitely need to do this at least like once a week, because I really want to get this done before like the end of October. Okay, last chapter, final chapter for the night. The following morning, Paul was sitting up in bed, propped up on the pile of pillows, drinking a cup of coffee, and eyeing those marks on the sides of the door with the guilty eye of a murderer who had just seen some bloody item of clothing of which he'd somehow neglected to dispose. Suddenly, Annie came rushing into the room, her eyes wide and bulging. She held a dust cloth in one hand. In the other, incredibly, she held a pair of handcuffs. What? It was all he had time for. She seized him with panicky strength and pulled him into an upright sitting position. Pain, the worst in days, billowed through his legs and he screamed. The coffee cup flew out of his hand and shattered on the floor. Things keep breaking in here, he thought, and then she saw the marks. Of course. Probably a long time ago. That was the only way he could account for this bizarre behavior. She had seen the marks after all, and this was the beginning of some new and spectacular punishment. "Shut up, stupid," she hissed, and then his hands were pinned behind him. And just as he heard the click of the handcuffs, he also heard a car turning into the driveway. He opened his mouth, meaning to speak, or perhaps scream again, and she stuffed the rag into it before he could do either. There was some ghastly dead taste on the rag. Pledge, he supposed, or end dust, or something like that. "Make no sound," she said, leaning over him with one hand on either side of his head, strands of her hair tickling his cheeks and forehead. "I warn you, Paul, if whoever that is hears something, or even if I hear something and think that he might have heard something, I will kill him, or them, then you, then myself." She stood up. Her eyes were bulging. There was sweat on her face and dried egg yolk on her lips. "Remember, Paul." He was nodding, but she didn't see. She was already running out. An old but well-preserved Chevy Bel Air had pulled up behind Annie's Cherokee. Paul heard a door open somewhere off the parlor and then bang shut. It gave off the oddly interrogative squeak that told him it was the closet where she kept her outdoor stuff. The man getting out of the car was as old and well-preserved as the car itself. A Colorado type, if ever Paul had seen one. He looked 65, but might be 80. He might be the senior partner of a law firm, or the semi-retired patriarch of a construction company, but was more likely a rancher or a realtor. He would be a Republican of the sort who would no more put a bumper sticker on his car than he would put a pair of pointy-toed Italian shoes on his feet. He must also be some sort of town official, and here on town business, because it was only on town business that a man like this and a reclusive woman like Annie Wilkes would have occasion to meet. Paul watched her hasten down the walk to the driveway, intent not on meeting but intercepting him. Here was something much like his earlier fantasy come true. Not a cop, but someone in authority. Authority had arrived at Annie's, and its arrival here could do nothing but shorten his own life. "Why not invite him in, Annie?" he thought, trying not to choke on the dusty rag. "Why not invite him in and show him your African bird?" Oh no, she would no more invite Mr. Rocky Mountain businessman in than she would drive Paul to Stapleton International and put a first-class ticket back to New York in his hand. She was talking even before she reached him, the breath blooming out of her mouth in shapes like cartoon balloons with no words written inside them. He held out a hand dressed in a narrowly elegant black leather glove. She looked at it briefly, contemptuously, then began to shake a finger in his face. More of those empty white balloons puffing from her mouth. She finished struggling into her coat and stopped shaking her finger long enough to rake the zipper up. He reached into the pocket of his topcoat and brought out a sheet of paper. Excuse me. He held it out to her almost apologetically. Although Paul had no way of knowing exactly what it was, he was sure that Annie had an adjective for it. Cockadoodle, maybe. She led him along the driveway, still talking. They passed beyond his sightline. He could see their shadows lying like construction paper cutouts on the snow, but that was all. She had done it on purpose, he realized dully. If he, Paul, couldn't see them, then there was no chance that Mr. Rancho Grande might look in through the guest room window and see him. The shadows remained on the melting snowpack of Annie's driveway for about 5 minutes. Once Paul actually heard Annie's voice, raised in an angry, hectoring shout. Those were a long 5 minutes for Paul. His shoulders ached. He found he couldn't move to ease the ache. After cuffing his hands together, she had somehow bound them to the bedstead. But the dust cloth in his mouth was the worst. The stink of the furniture polish was making his head ache, and he was growing steadily more nauseated. He concentrated grimly on controlling it. He had no interest in choking to death, his windpipe full of vomit, while Annie argued with an elderly town official who got his hair trimmed once a week at the local tonsorial emporium and probably wore rubbers over his black Oxfords all winter long. Cold, sick sweat had broken on his forehead by the time they reappeared. Now Annie was holding the paper. She followed Mr. Rancho Grande, shaking her finger at his back, those empty cartoon balloons issuing from her mouth. Mr. Rancho Grande would not look around at her. His face was carefully blank, only his lips, pressed together so tightly that they almost disappeared, gave away some inward emotion. Anger, perhaps. Distaste, yes. That was probably closer. You think she's crazy. You and all your poker cronies, who probably control this whole minor league ballpark of a town, probably played a hand of a lowball or something to see who got this shit detail. No one likes to bring bad news to crazy people. But oh, Mr. Rancho Grande, if you knew just how crazy she really is, I don't think you'd turn your back on her like that. He got into the Bel Air. He closed the door. Now she stood beside the car, shaking her finger at his closed window. And again Paul could dimly hear her voice. Think you are so smart. The Bel Air began to back slowly down the driveway. Mr. Rancho Grande was ostentatiously not looking at Annie, whose teeth were bared. Louder still. You think you're such a great big wheel. Suddenly she kicked the front bumper of Mr. Rancho Grande's car. Kicked it hard enough to knock packed chunks of snow out of the wheel wells. The old guy had been looking over his right shoulder, guiding the car down the driveway. Now he looked back at her, startled out of the careful neutrality he had maintained all through his visit. Well, I'll tell you something, you dirty bird. Little dogs go to the bathroom all over big wheels. What do you think of that, huh? Whatever he thought of it, Mr. Rancho Grande was not going to give Annie the satisfaction of seeing it. That neutral expression dropped over his face again like the visor on a suit of armor. He backed out of Paul's sight. She stood there for a moment, hands fisted on hips, then stalked back towards the house. He heard the kitchen door open and explode shut. Well, he's gone, Paul thought. Mr. Rancho Grande is gone, but I'm here. Oh yes, I'm here. Alright, so how many pages did we get through today? Almost 60? We're on 184. I'm thinking this is... I like how this is developing. Although honestly, like reading the passages of like the like fake book he's writing or whatever is like it's kind of a slog, honestly, because it's like written in a very like flowery sort of way. So that's not too fun, but hopefully going forward there's gonna be like less and less of that. Because I feel like I speak for all of us when I say we're all more interested in like the main story. But yeah, oh, that was probably very loud, I'm sorry. But yeah, I think this is a good spot to leave off on. It's not as much of a cliffhanger as I've been leaving them off on before, but I feel like it's still a pretty interesting part to to continue back onto later. So let's see, what are we doing tonight? What are we doing going forward? Oh, my throat. I mean, it's not like bad, like it has been before, but I still get a little bit like yuck, like my throat gets dry really easily. I really need to like look into that like vocal stamina stuff. It's time, high time. I mean, it's normally I wouldn't do a raid when we have like only this many people, but I feel like just for hello. Or I guess yeah. I feel like we can raid my good friend, my pal. I almost said buddy and pal at the same time, which would be Putty, I guess. But he's about to like play some more spooky games, so I guess that's kind of like keeping on with the theme. Tomorrow I'm gonna be playing Yumaniki. I'm gonna be looking at a guide because we need to like hurry up and get that done. And I don't know what I'm doing, so I kind of have to look at a guide for that. So yeah, that's happening. I think we're definitely gonna do some more reading next week as well. But we'll see how my schedule plays out. So I guess we're just gonna get that raid started. Oh shit, God damn it, it won't let me do it like in the like Twitch chat pop out I have because I'm not logged in there, so I guess I'm just gonna have to like do this manually. Stream manager? Yeah. We're gonna have to do this the old-fashioned way. Because Christ. Okay. So that's popping off. Hopefully. Alright. So that'll be it. And yeah. So have a good morning, evening, afternoon, night, whatever it is, wherever you are. And